I wanted to talk about the emergence while we were away of some alarming evidence that whoever they are, they've taken some more hostages.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Who are they?
Very troubling. Well, I wanted to talk a bit about Douglas Murray, who is...
He took hostages, or he's been taken?
No. Apparently he's been taken hostage based on some of the things that he's been saying. And I will say, as I've said before about others, Douglas Murray's a friend of mine, and that's part of why I'm concerned about the strange noises that he has been making. Let's see. Why don't we start with the clip on him on Bill Maher's program of Douglas Murray. I think this was just this last Friday.
It's always interesting to see what happens at the point of victory. What do you do with your victory? And if those people on the American right who are now in the ascendant, if they decide that they want to use their point of victory to, for instance, lie about the origins of the Russia-Ukraine war, or lie about the nature of Hamas, or lie about the state of Israel, or lie about history. I mean, the reason I did this pushback was, I mean, you just have to. I mean, you just have to, in my view. It's basic social hygiene. If you've got somebody who's coming along who pretends to be a historian, who then can always do the thing of saying, oh, I actually don't call myself a historian, it's just other people I allow to call me a historian. I'm not a car mechanic, but if I kept on being introduced as a car mechanic, I would say, oh, no, you got the wrong guy. So they don't mind it. They don't mind it. They have this slip out. These people that I was trying to call out on Joe's show, they are doing things like Hitler wasn't that much of an anti-Semite. Main problem in the 20th century was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was the warmonger. Adolf Hitler wanted peace. And I just, look, it's a matter of social hygiene. Don't feed me this shit. And this is all... And you know, there's obviously this crossover between the people who are just trolls. They say this because they think it's really fun to do the Jewish question, to do like a bit of Holocaust denial, a bit of Hitler praise, a bit of Churchill degradation. They think it's kind of funny. What they're watering and what's going to come up underneath them are going to be people who believe this rot. And a lot of people, you can clearly see on the right at the moment, are very happy if you can denigrate the tradition of Winston Churchill and pretend that Adolf Hitler wasn't so bad, because then you can do things like Christian nationalism. You can do really, really tough nationalist stuff. They basically...
You can buy Kanye albums.
That's the last stage. That's like the ultimate. After they've absolved Adolf Hitler, they want to absolve Kanye, and then they're going to get to the point of hell.
Right. Well, it's a great book. Everybody should read it. Thank you.
All right, so he says a lot of things in there. Some of them are quite reasonable, but the problem is where he is headed with this line of reasoning, which we can find actually in an article that he wrote that was in the New York Post. So you want to put up that article and... Okay, so Douglas Murray, so-called Israel-Hamas-Ukraine war experts spew false info on Joe Rogan's podcast. There has to be a standard. Now, presumably he didn't write that title, but here's how this article concludes.
These are his words now.
These are his words now. He says, what the standards are in the new media, especially on podcasts, is still being worked out. But there must be some. Otherwise, the new media will lead people into errors and evils far greater than the old media could ever dream of. Now, I find that completely shocking for a couple of reasons. As I say, Douglas Murray is a friend. He's been on DarkHorse twice, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I know something about the way he thinks and the values that he holds. And I also know him to be one of the best orators that we have. He speaks with extreme precision. And so to have him say something that violates not only his own values at such a profound level, but values that are actually not just central to, but maybe the central values of the West, which Douglas Murray has been
Staunch defender of.
strident champion of, since long before most knew that it was even in jeopardy,
Yes.
raises some alarm. What is going on with Douglas that suddenly he's ready to make an anti-free speech argument like this? I truly cannot imagine. It's like another hostage video where he is alerting us that something must be wrong. It's like he's sending us a message by saying something that he would not say. It must imply that there's something we can't see.
If I try to steelman his position, though, standards does not mean enforced by an external agency. Standards can be like morals as opposed to laws, right? Like, we need a culture of such and such that we are then expected to, not just allowed to, but expected to point out when someone breaches the sort of cultural standards that we have accepted. Now, I don't think that podcast land, new media landscape, whatever it is a thing that can have a culture. But if I try to put myself into his head and understand what he could be arguing for that does make sense, it's more like that rather than, and there shall be a governing body and I shall be on it and I shall be determining what it is that you are allowed to say.
Well, of course, he's not arguing for a governing body. What he's arguing for is that we start paying attention to the responsible things over in the alternative media space rather than the Wild West of the Joe Rogan podcast. And so if we take, for example, a couple of the responsible platforms in the new media space, let's say the Free Press and Quillette, right? These are institutions that match what Douglas appears to be advocating here. And we simply compare them to, the Joe Rogan podcast over the course of something like, COVID. And we see how they performed. Well, the Free Press and Quillette
Failed.
Is there a polite term for shit the bed?
Failed.
Failed. Okay, that's it. Yeah. They failed utterly. Mm-hmm. And not only did they fail utterly, but they revealed that whatever standards they may have are actually not about prioritizing truth above all else,
because they didn't update and correct their errors once it was clear that they had made errors.
Not only clear that they had made errors, but once both Quillette and the Free Press had people in their immediate social circles who suffered from vaccine injuries, and yet they couldn't even figure that out. So
they couldn't bring themselves to say anything.
Whatever the answer is, they had a journalistic obligation to tell the world that they were being, the public was being lied to in ways that was going to cause the public to do grave physiological injury to themselves. Mm-hmm. They couldn't bring themselves to report that story. So how did Joe Rogan do? Pretty great. Was everything that was said on Joe Rogan's program right? No. But you know what you could pretty much follow in order to figure out what the story of COVID was, whether we're talking about COVID origins, whether we're talking about vaccine safety and effectiveness, whether we're talking about repurposed drugs, whether we're talking about how to understand the evidence of harm in the aftermath of these things. Joe Rogan figured it out. How? Through exactly the mechanism that Douglas Murray is arguing against right here. Okay. Douglas Murray is arguing you got to have standards. You can't just put on people who are reporting things that, they're not even experts. Well, the non-experts actually did figure out how to follow the evidence and reach the correct conclusions. And a bunch of us figured out how to dodge the frickin' shots. And I don't know a single person who's sorry they did. Not one person. I know person after person who regrets getting the shots. I don't know anybody who listened to Joe Rogan, didn't get a shot, and regrets it because the horror show represented by the damage.
I just to be fair, you wouldn't regret it because you could just go give a shot.
No, you would.
But I agree with you. I think the point is right.
You would regret it because you didn't get the shot, and that caused you to get COVID, and you died, right? Or somebody you love died. And the answer is that didn't happen. Right. Do you know why? Because the shot was more dangerous than the disease. We were led to believe that the disease was more dangerous. All of the harms that were well known about these shots before they were put on the market were buried so that we couldn't see them. So the fact is, the ability to discover that was present. The mechanism by which we discovered it is well known. It is the exact thing that the founders of this great country put first on the list of our enumerated rights for a goddamn reason. It was, they couldn't name a podcast. They couldn't have called out Joe Rogan, but they came as close as they could come to saying, sorry, there's no source of high quality information versus low quality information, malinformation, disinformation. You can't know ahead of time. The mechanism by which you come to understand what is true, Douglas, is discussion. It is discussion in which nobody gets to set the rules about what kinds of opinions can be investigated. And yes, that does cause some garbage stuff to be said, but what reveals that it's garbage stuff? Free and open inquiry that reveals that actually it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. That's how you do it, Konstantin Kisin. I don't know what's wrong with these people. It's really like somebody has figured out how to threaten them into saying things that they full well know aren't true.
They're becoming what they were fighting against.
They're becoming what they were fighting against. And I must say, in both of those cases, I feel like I don't think I was duped to begin with, that they actually held free speech as a high value. So the fact that they are backing away from it and calling for some kind of standard, self-imposed or otherwise, to prevent certain, the fact is, heterodoxy is heterodoxy. And it often sounds crazy, and most of it is. But the good stuff is the stuff that sounds crazy that then does strangely stand up to scrutiny. That's how you figure out what's coming, is you look at the heterodox stuff and you figure out what has predictive power. And you can't get around that. And the people who tried failed. So,
but I think there's an error in thinking that imagines when you're in the middle of a fight. And there are a lot of people joining from all places, all sides, people you never knew before, didn't know exist. And some of those people, like us, may think, wow, this is nuts, and the ground is really unstable, and we're going to definitely try to find some place from which we can tell what's true and what's not. But we know that the ground will continue to move, and that there will continue to be changes in the environment, in the social world, whatever it is, that mean that once you've arrived at some place that is true now, doesn't mean that if you stay still, it will always be true. It seems like the argument that Douglas is making here, and that you say Konstantin is making as well, imagines that in those early chaotic days of everyone going like, well, I'm heterodox, and they really seem to be, and right, many of us really seem to be, that actually the model in their head, whether conscious or not, probably not, was once we get this figured, we're there. We just got to cement the thing, and then we'll be at the center, and we'll be the media that needs to be, and then we will resist all comers.
Yeah, but I want to bring two things in from conversations we've had at other places and other times. Longtime viewers will be familiar. One of them is the idea that there is a subgroup within those who fought courageously against the woke revolution. There is a subgroup that feels like woke really was the problem. And actually, if we can just get rid of the woke, then we can go back to doing what we do. And the answer is no, the system was so thoroughly rotten to the core. The reason that the institutions were vulnerable to woke was that they were already effectively deceased.
Precisely.
Right?
Yes.
So you can't just get rid of the woke. That was the mistake, as you have pointed out so eloquently at UATX. Mm-hmm. You can't just get rid of the woke and reboot the institutions. You actually need new institutions that are immune to the things that made them vulnerable to woke. And it is exactly the same thing in journalistic space. You can't just take the woke out of the New York Times and go back to being the New York Times under the name Free Press. Actually, you have to learn the lesson of what happened to the New York Times, whether it was Project Mockingbird or it was some sort of organic arrogance that took it down. You have to fix the basic problem in order to have an institution worth having.
And actually have the courage of your convictions and be prepared to be wrong sometimes, and have to step back and say, that thing we're taking back, we were wrong about it, and not just be cringing in the corner by flying a banner of courage.
Right.
Which is the worst kind of hypocrisy.
It is the worst kind of hypocrisy. And look, to take another friend to task, Bari You owe us an apology. You do. You got COVID wrong. We had it right. That's now obvious. And so you can't take the Wild West podcasts and shove them out of the way for your new institution. I mean, frankly, just like Quillette, Bari demonstrated part of what she was about. She was exactly right, right? What Bari used to say was, these institutions cannot be repaired. We are going to have to build parallel ones. That's what she used to say. And she was right, and she did it. She was able to build an institution, just like Claire Lehman before her, right? They built parallel institutions that had potential, but those institutions were not founded around the basic principle of following the truth wherever it may lead. The evidence tells you what is right. Predictive power is the answer. And at the point you've gotten something wrong, like COVID, you can't just find the middle ground and slap both sides and become the new institution. You don't have the recipe for figuring out what's true. And so, I don't know. I'm hoping that all of these people who at one point seemed to see the correct direction to be heading and seemed to understand how broken the institutions were, will understand that as much as you may not like it, that lots of ideas are going to be discussed on Joe Rogan and lots of guests who have some perspective that you are certain is wrong and you may be correct in that. The answer is that's how we figure it out. And I will point out, in that clip on Bill Maher, Douglas Murray says something about, these terrible people are questioning the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Well, here's the thing. First of all, I want to point out, you and I were having discussions long before people started freaking out about all of this anti-Semitism on Twitter. You and I were talking about what I called Nazi Twitter. I was trying to alert people that it was there. And in fact, I think we have a clip of that. Jen, you want to put on that clip? We talked about it briefly some weeks ago, maybe a month and a half ago. I had gotten, for whatever reason on Twitter, dumped into what I call Nazi Twitter, right? And I tweeted about it yesterday or the day before, and I got back a reaction that I was not expecting. First thing is, people think that I am using that term the way it's been leveled at people like us or Bobby Kennedy, right? That I'm abusing the term, that Nazi is a buzzword and that you can tweak people's amygdala by using it.
Nope.
No. When I say Nazi Twitter, I am talking about a part of Twitter where swastikas are not viewed as negative, where Hitler is quoted in an effort to illustrate that he is not who we were told he was. In fact, the idea that is commonly circulated in this part of Twitter is that the television is lying to you, which I'm sure it is, but that the television is lying to you, that Hitler actually was not interested in war. He was interested in peace, and that the narrative that has been created around him in the aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II is a construction of, you guessed it, Jews in Hollywood. Right? Now,
Amazing.
Okay, so...
And that was from a year or two ago?
I can't remember. It was July of 2023, maybe?
Okay.
Something like that. In any case, so I am not somebody who has a soft spot in my heart for this stuff.
Of course not.
At all.
Right.
I have no tolerance of it. But, first of all, what I have said, boy, I don't know how far back I've been saying this, 2018 at least. I have been saying, if you start bullying people into what they can say, right? If you start exerting standards of the kind that Douglas Murray is talking about here, you are going to create a backlash. You are going to fuel that white nationalist impulse, right? By telling people what they're not allowed to say.
Sure.
Whereas allowing people to say what they will and hashing it out in some sort of a marketplace of ideas actually allows us to reveal why that perspective isn't any good, why it's un-American, and it is the only path forward. The other thing is going to cause the exact problem in question by causing resentment of what you're not allowed to think or say, and it's going to drive people into that camp, not out of it. Second thing, though, is, again, Murray says, that people are playing with the idea that Hitler wasn't anti-Semitic. Well, the interesting thing is, if you go into the evidence, you actually find that as anti-Semitic as Hitler and the Nazis were, that actually the record reflects that they are facultative about this because there is a higher drive that they have. And I'm not going to go deeply into this here, but the number of places where simple race rage does not predict Nazi behavior is substantial. And the question is, what are we to do with that? It actually raises interesting questions about what the genocide that the Nazis perpetrated was about. And I would argue that our hope of preventing future genocides requires us to go into that territory and figure out what the underlying algorithm was. So don't tell me I don't get to talk about the anti-Semitism of the Nazis, and I don't get to investigate all of the evidence that says they were driven by, some sort of irrational rage, and all of the evidence that says, no, there was something else going on inside the Third Reich. The answer is, we talk about that stuff. That's how we figure it out. Should we do that on podcasts? No. That's not the right place to do it. But in the absence of institutions that know how to do it, podcasts is a decent substitute. So, let's build the institutions, but they can't be institutions that have a higher purpose than truth-seeking. That has to be the higher purpose of any institution that's going to be capable of doing the job. And until we have some parallel institutions that have that as their highest aim, we're going to do it on podcast. Sorry, Douglas.
Well, that's an excellent segue to the last thing that we want to talk about. If you are
I'm
done
ready.
Talking about Podcastistan?
Podcastistan, that's what they're calling us now.